So Marty, we were joking before this started that now we're in the phase of our career in which we're called seniors. My recollection is that you and I met one another for the first time 37 years
Ooh.
ago in the spring of 1980 when we worked together in the Attorney General's office on the Laconia State School litigation is what I recall you first working on in that office. Am I right on that?
Yes, and I think you were responsible for hiring me on that case.
You mean your tenure in New Hampshire is my fault?
No, I actually, I had been practicing in Boston since I graduated from law school in '78. I was looking to come to New Hampshire. I wanted to try cases, and so I had interviewed with Tom Rath at the AG's office, and he had promised me sometime in, I think, December of 1979 that I would have the next opening in the criminal division. But there wasn't one when I came up in February of 1980, so I took the bar, and I think you and I talked about getting some help on the Laconia State School case, and it was probably one of the more interesting cases of my career.
Well, and mine as well. It was a 3-month trial, and I was, I think, 30 years old, so it was a change. So you and I have the same background in one sense. We both started practicing law in Boston and then came to New Hampshire. Let's fill in a little bit of that background in what we'll call Marty Van Oot, the early years. One of my partners says that everything in my life comes back to the Red Sox, and I know that you grew up with Carlton Fisk, and I can't remember whether you lived in Vermont and went to high school in New Hampshire or vice versa.
Okay, so I grew up in a very small town in Vermont, Westminster Station, and went to grade school in a 4-room, 8-grade school. When I was in 7th grade, my parents sent me across the river to go to school in Walpole, New Hampshire, because they thought there was a better opportunity there, and there was also no high school in the town that I lived in. So the plan was that I would go to Walpole High School, but as it turned out, the school became part of the regional high school, Fall Mountain Regional High School, and so that's where I ended up going to high school, and that's where I knew some of the Fisks, not Carlton. Carlton was ahead of me, but I went to high school with his sisters, Janet, and his brother, Conrad.
So that was Charlestown, New Hampshire then?
Charlestown, New Hampshire, yeah.
Was
part of the regional school.
And how big was the high school?
I don't know. I think our graduating class was about 100.
So let's talk about what happened after that. I know you went to Middlebury. How did you choose that? And
that's going to be a little bit embarrassing. How I made my choice. I've made a lot of choices on sort of interesting bases. I decided I was going to go to Middlebury College when I was about 9 or 10 years old because my family skied every weekend, and we took other kids from town skiing with us, and one of the people that went skiing with us was a very handsome young man named Johnny Morton, and Johnny Morton was about 6 years older than I was, and he was very kind to me and helped me up the J-bar. And I developed a terrible crush on him that I never disclosed to him. But
well,
when I heard that he was going to Middlebury College, I decided at I think age 9 or 10 that if Johnny Morton went to Middlebury College, that's where I was going to go. And he went, and I went 6 years later.
Well, if for some reason this video goes viral, John Morton will determine. We'll find out why you went to Middlebury.
I subsequently ran into him several years ago and told him the story, but. It was a good choice. It was a great place to go.
Well, you certainly did well there based on the fact that you were in Phi Beta Kappa. So why law school?
Again, a very interesting basis. I was an English major. I loved English literature, and My plan was to go to graduate school and teach English literature at the college level. That's what I really wanted to do. But when I was a junior at Middlebury, I took a couple of constitutional law courses with a fabulous professor named Murray Dry. And I also learned that I could probably go to any graduate school that I wanted to, but the job market for English majors at that time was bleak at best. And after
That hasn't changed much
no,
in the last 40
it hasn't
years.
changed. So I decided, well, that I enjoyed the constitutional law course, and it also involved working with language. And so I thought I would go to law school. So I looked around. And another fortuitous decision, I decided to go to Northeastern, which had a co-op program, on the basis of a conversation that I had in my parents' kitchen with a friend of theirs who was a judge on the Second Circuit. And he had had a clerk who had worked for him on the, I guess he was on the district court in Vermont at that point.
Who was that, Marty?
Jim Oakes.
Mm-hmm.
And he had had a law clerk named Candy, I can't remember her last name, who had gone on to clerk at the United States Supreme Court after clerking for him, and she had gone to Northeastern, and he raved about the co-op program, and I looked into it, and I was lucky enough to get into it, and it was the perfect law school for me.
And in fact, Northeastern led you to your first full-time job in the law in Boston?
Yep, again, I have 4 siblings, and so my parents were very clear that they would help us all get through college, but anything that we wanted to do after that was on our own nickel. So I had no money in law school, literally no money. And so when it came time to picking a co-op, I just would go through the book and I would pick the Boston law firm that was paying the most money and apply there. And I was lucky enough in my first co-op to get a job at Goodwin Procter. And at the end of my first co-op, I really didn't have enough money to go back to school. So I asked if I could do a back-to-back co-op, which is unusual. And my mentor at Goodwin Procter, Arthur Stevenson, agreed that I could do that, which turned out to be a great experience because I really got to know people. I got to work more closely with people. Goodwin Procter was a large firm by Boston
those
standards
in those days, yeah.
You know, and I think it was like 70 lawyers, which it's now much larger than that, obviously. So I had a great experience there, and after law school, went to work there for a short period of time before coming to New Hampshire.
If I remember correctly, when you were working, maybe at Goodwin Procter, but maybe when you were in law school as well, you were a single mom. So Ben had come along by that point.
I was.
How old was Ben then? He would have been.
When I was in law school, he was a regular watcher of Sesame Street. So, and which actually was great because it really took some of the pressure off. I didn't have time to obsess about studying. If I came home from classes, it usually was to go to Jamaica Pond and with his fishing pole, or go for a bike ride in the park. So.
I'd forgotten about that connection between us, that at some point I was Ben's soccer coach. I think he was in 6th grade or 7th grade at the time. Anyway, where is Ben now? I understand you've got some grandchildren.
Yep, he's married. He lives down in Rhode Island, near the University of Rhode Island, and works in the timber frame business, so very happy.
And how old are your grandchildren?
I have 4 now. Olivia, the oldest, will be 15 in a few weeks, and the youngest is 10.
So all of us, I think, all of us who are lucky, have somebody in our lives, either a great teacher or a friend of a parent who influenced you. Do you have someone like that in your younger years that really inspired you, or encouraged you to do something you might not otherwise have done?
I've had a lot of people along the way for whom I'm very grateful, and it sort of depends on which stage of my life that I was relying on them. I had a wonderful English teacher in high school who really encouraged me to write. I've had wonderful mentors in my professional career. Beginning at Goodwin Procter, but I think probably the most important people were really the people that I first met in New Hampshire. People like you, Debbie Cooper, who was one of the first women in the Attorney General's office. And then as I practiced in different law firms, there have been other lawyers who have inspired me. Judges, colleagues. This is just a wonderful state to practice in.
Debbie was a special person, and for those who don't
Yes,
know,
she was.
looking at this interview, Debbie died of cancer probably 12 or 13 years ago. What was it about Debbie that made her a good mentor to you?
She had a wonderful, first of all, she was a terrific lawyer. She had great judgment. And very compassionate. For me, she modeled that you could be a good lawyer and have your own style. She had a terrific sense of humor. She led the office by example, and we just had a great time.
Well, Debbie and Ann Cagwin were the first women hired by the Attorney General's office after Irma Matthews had been there quite a few years before. And Debbie and Ann took some grief, but gave equal amount of measure to Justice Souter when he was Attorney General. So let's talk.
And that continued with your partner, Greg Smith. I can remember one time Greg left for a brief period of time, and Debbie and I decided that we would redo his office.
Debbie was the deputy at that point?
Yes,
or?
we thought his office was a little staid, so we did go to the local 5 and 10 and get some things. We filled his family photograph frames with some pictures that probably shouldn't have, but it was a great place to practice. There were I was in the criminal division. Debbie was in the civil division. At the end of my career there, I became head of the civil division when you left.
That was at the end of your time in the office?
Yeah.
I'd forgotten that.
Yeah, for about a year, and so I worked closely with Deb, who was the deputy at that point.
At that point, you were correcting all the mistakes I had made a few years before, I'm sure.
Not at all, not at all.
It reminds me of the time when I've forgotten who it was in the office, pasted several centerfolds from Playboy magazine on the wall of David Souter's office one day. I don't remember that a legislator came in during that period of time, but
That may have been what inspired Deb to suggest to me that we decorate Greg Smith's office. So there was also a velvet Elvis painting that circulated as a birthday present. We had some fabulous softball teams, a indoor volleyball team that I remember playing with Krista and Steve McAuliffe and Don Peralt and some other avid volleyball players, but it's a good place to work. And the work in the criminal division the criminal division was probably the best job I've ever had in terms of interesting cases.
Well, I think a lot of us who now say, of course, the halcyon days of the Attorney General's office when we were there.
Yes,
of course.
exactly.
But it was a good time to be in the office, and certainly an interesting career move after you'd been in a big Boston law firm like you and I had been. So talk a little bit about that. What made the office special at that point, and and how that stayed with you over your career, if it has.
Well, I knew even from my brief experience at Goodwin Procter that I really wanted to try cases. And I knew that I probably wasn't ever going to try a case if I stayed at Goodwin Procter, or that it wasn't going to be likely. I worked on some very interesting cases, but they were big cases, and it was a lot of document production and stuff like that. So when I got to the Attorney General's office, the first experience I had obviously was with you on the Laconia State School case, where we did go through a 3-month trial with experts, worldwide experts, important issues, and a lot of writing and argument. I didn't actually get to try much of the case, but
you would have if you'd come in earlier.
Yeah. Well, you had your trial team was exhausted, so by the time I
Any
got
help
there.
we could get.
But when I started in the criminal division, I'll never forget my first day in the office. I had gone down to the cafeteria for lunch and came back up and was told that there was a homicide over in Plastow, and so I was to go because the practice in the division at that time, and I think it still is the practice, was you went to the scene because that's where you got the best understanding of what had happened, and you work the case from the scene on. So having eaten my egg salad sandwich, I then went to my first autopsy, and so it was a case involving a juvenile, and it just was not very good at things like autopsies, but it was fascinating. It was fascinating for me working with the state police and with local police on these cases. I gained an appreciation for the amount of work that goes into preparing a case for trial, the amount of responsibility that lawyers in the Attorney General's office were given was just extraordinary. And the weird thing was you didn't think anything about it. You just thought, well, okay, of course I'm supposed to be, deciding somebody's or making decisions that are going to affect somebody's life and somebody's freedom. I came to love the putting the puzzle together of trying to solve a case, and the trial work was just, we tried cases in teams of 2, so it was a learning experience usually for both members of the team. One person was usually only a few months senior to the other person. I got to do a lot of brief writing because the Attorney General's office did all the briefs for the criminal cases. So, and the bench was much smaller at that time. So because we were in court so often, we really got to know the 10 members of the Superior Court and the 5 members of the Supreme Court very well, and learned a lot from the war stories in chambers.
Yeah, I was reminiscing the other day that it was 39 years ago today, on this Tuesday, that I got a complaint that resulted in me being in the federal court in Boston the next day, the First Circuit that night, and the U.S. Supreme Court on the Friday of that week, and all within about 72 hours. Yeah.
This was the flag case.
So,
do you still have the yellow pad that you wrote your brief on the plane?
No, I don't. We actually handed in the brief. So, but I think that was part of, and you and I, I'm jumping way ahead here, but you and I are both members of the American College of Trial Lawyers, and there's a constant lament about the vanishing jury trial, or the vanishing trial for that matter. If you were giving younger lawyers, and they're all younger than us these days, advice on how to get trial experience, what would you tell them?
I think that the only place that you're still seeing a lot of trial work is on the criminal side, and on the state side of the criminal side, because I don't think there's that much criminal trial, jury trials that are going on in the federal court. Could be wrong, but I think if you want to try cases, if you want to learn how to try cases, you really have to get in the trenches And
Well, the experience of coming from what in those days was a large law firm and learning how to research everything to the nth degree, and then going into an office where you were told, here's a file, go to
Yeah.
court tomorrow morning. It was a big difference. Who was the head of the criminal division when you started out?
David Harrigan.
And who did you try most of your cases with in those days? If you can say that there was one person.
I think I tried several cases with Rich Nelson. I tried a few with Brian Tucker, who infamously, at least from my recollection, handed me the file when we got to the court. Fortunately, it was only, I think, some appeal from a misdemeanor or something like that. But we did not have a lot of discussion about the case before I tried it. So I think I tried with a lot of different people, and I also tried a few by myself. So
Was Pete Massot in the office then?
Pete Massot was in the office. I don't think I tried a case with Pete. We had lots of cases where we were both involved, but
I say that because we'll get to that, but both Rich and Pete became your partners in the law firm that you started.
Yep.
Is there some particular criminal trial, either tragic or funny, that you remember that from that time in the office? As you said earlier, to the extent we can remember what happened yesterday at this point in our life.
I think there were two cases that impacted me a great deal. One was a homicide case in the North Country, in Grafton County. The case was in Rumney, and I think I was affected because it involved the victim was a young woman who had been left alone in her home with her 2-year-old son. Her friends had gone to Boston for the day to help another friend move, and there was an individual who was living in the area who was friendly with this group of people that had grown up together in I think Wakefield, Massachusetts, and moved to Rumney. And something happened. Nobody knows exactly what happened, but he stabbed her. And the thing that I remember about the case was that at some point in the middle of the struggle, he had picked up the baby, the 2-year-old, and put the baby in the bathroom. This was in the middle of February, in just his underwear, and that's where the baby was found early the next morning when her friends arrived back from Boston. And so I actually interviewed the baby, if you will, at the hospital the next morning, and I can still remember how the baby reacted. And the trial of the case was just very difficult because these people, her friends, were all very close to her.
And the mother was killed? Or
the mother was killed, yes, and she had tried to call, and it was just a horrible scene, and the discovery of the baby. I cried in the opening, and I think every single one of the witnesses, including some guys had Purple Hearts in Vietnam, cried in their testimony about finding the baby alone in the house, and I still wonder where that baby is and how he did. So
I think to the extent that the lawyers who were in the civil division in the Attorney General's office remember cases, the criminal prosecutors tend to remember those kinds of cases very well. And
yeah.
I remember traveling around with some of the criminal investigators from time to time, and they would constantly point out, well, we found a body here, or we found a body over there, someone was murdered in that house,
Yeah, well, I to this day, I still drive through certain towns and think, oh, that's where that happened, that's where this happened.
So let's talk a little bit about your decision to leave the Attorney General's office and how you made that. And my recollection is that when you left, you went to Divine Millimet. Is that right?
I did. And at that time in the Attorney General's office, there was sort of, at least on the criminal side, it was kind of a, you had a 3-year commitment, and it was pretty much 3 years up and out unless you, as you did, stayed in an more of an administrative position.
But even then, I was there for 5 years, and that was somewhat unusually long for people in the office in those days.
Right, and it was not at that time a career position. First of all, the salary was pretty low. It's hard to believe I took a $5,000 pay cut. So when I came to New Hampshire, so I went from making 25 to making 20. Those were the days. So at the end of my 3 years, I did go to Devine Millimet again because it had a reputation of being a place where you could try cases, and I went into the litigation department then, which had some absolutely great trial lawyers, and I did my share of insurance defense cases. You still had an opportunity to try cases.
So I know, and this may be wrong, but my sense is that you and Mike McDonough worked together quite a bit, and that Mike was a mentor.
Mike was a great mentor. I think it was difficult for him to deal with the fact that there was a woman in his office trying cases. I do remember driving back from our first trial together. We had to drive all the way from Hillsborough County Superior Court back to the other end of Elm Street to where Devine Millimet's offices were. I was asking him, as I would have asked my colleagues in the AG's office, so, what witnesses do you want me to take tomorrow, and what can I do? Well, I was fully expecting to go back into the office and prepare for the next day. And he said, no. He said, you go home and make dinner for your wife, for your husband and your child. I said, okay. And it was basically, what's a nice girl like you doing trying cases? But he turned out to be a great mentor.
When did you become a partner at Devine Millimet, and how many other women were partners when you did?
I think I started in, July of '83 at Devine Millimet, and I became a partner at the end of '84, early '85. I'm not exactly sure.
And Susan Dupree was there at the time.
Susan Dupree was a partner, and there was one other female partner, I think.
So several years ago, I've forgotten. I know there's that because Jennifer Parent and I are partners. That there's this 100th anniversary of Women in the Bar coming up. But I also remember an event several years ago in which that celebrating the first 100 women in the New Hampshire bar. And do you know where you sat in the first 100?
I just missed it. Yep, I was not in it. So I think it cut off at 77.
But my recollection is that, for example, Debbie Cooper was kind of in the middle of that, in the 50s somewhere or something. It was so there weren't that many women practicing law in New Hampshire when you started.
There really weren't. No.
So you just missed the cut at 100, and that was probably at least 80 years maybe of women in the bar in New Hampshire, so pretty small group.
At that time, but it's that obviously things have changed.
And if you'd added up the number of those women lawyers who were trial lawyers, probably even smaller, I would think.
And that group has stayed small.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I guess it depends on how you define a trial lawyer. Somebody who's just doing litigation, it's a pretty stressful practice.
Yeah.
It's deadlines. I'm not a natural in the courtrum. So I have to make up for what I lack in
If you're not
natural.
by now, Marty, you never will be.
I have to make up for what I lack in natural talent with just a lot of preparation. There's just a lot of work that goes into trying a case.
Well, I think no matter whether you're a natural or not, preparation is all important in that. You know, the old saying that there's no excuse for not knowing everything.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest difference between civil litigation and the Attorney General's office. In the Attorney General's office, I think, as you know, we had the luxury, at least on the criminal side, when we had a homicide coming up, a homicide case to try, you got to drop pretty much all of your other cases, and you got that 6-week or 4-week or whatever you needed period where you could just shut yourself in a room and prepare. You had the state police at your disposal. I need to talk to this witness. I want to meet with this person. I need this information. And there was no billable hours involved. And now, you know,
It'd be nice if we had those resources at our disposal in every trial.
Right. It was such a luxury, and now you still have to do the work, but you have to be very conscious of the cost of the time that it takes, and you still have a lot of other cases. It's a lot different in terms of the scheduling. You know, we're all overscheduled, but then cases drop out and settle out, and you know, mediation has been a great thing in my practice. Cases
Not
get
if you
resolved.
want to try cases, but it's so just so people understand, how many cases have you, in general, the last 10 years, how many cases have you tried a year?
In the last 10 years, I've had.
You actually try quite a bit because you do employment law, and that tends to, I think.
Right. I can think of 4 cases I've had in the last 5 years. So it's one to 2 a year, but they're jury trials, and they're a week or 2 weeks. I'm not trying as many bench trials as I used to try, and I think that that's because in the last 5 years I've been doing exclusively employment litigation. So those cases are either jury trials or they get settled.
So did you then go, when you left Devine, did you then go directly to form your own firm? Is that, I can't recall whether there was another firm.
I know.
We've said, Marty, you had trouble holding a job.
I have had trouble holding a job. I have a short attention span, and I like to move on to new things. No, I left Devine Millimet when John Broderick and Steve Merrill left.
So you were in Merrill and Broderick for a while before you had forgotten that.
Yeah. So Steve and John formed Merrill and Broderick in 1989, and we had a great time. It was an interesting practice.
Just 4 or 5. Who else was there besides you, and was Rich Nelson there?
Rich Nelson left Devine at the same time, and Mark Dean. And then from there.
So you and Rich were the people who didn't become governor or chief justice of the Supreme Court.
Yes, we were not on the letterhead, and Steve decided to go on to do different things. So at that time, Rich and I joined back up with Pete Massot, with whom we'd worked at the New Hampshire Attorney General's office, and Tupper Kinder, who had also been at the Attorney General's office and who was at Ransomar at the time. Pete was at Orr & Reno, and we formed Nelson Kinder. Started the practice just as the nightmare on Elm Street began. When all the banks closed and the FDIC marched in, we were able to get really good, cheap office space as a result. And that was interesting, fun practice. It was exclusively litigation. We did a lot of legal malpractice defense work, which I found, being a lawyer's lawyer, was fascinating, and it was also great for somebody with a short attention span because you got to try the case within the case, which meant that you had to master a substantive area of the law with every case. So in some cases, I would learn everything there was to know about bankruptcy law. I would forget it as soon as the case was over, but I would know it for a short period of time. And then I got to like 1999, and I really just needed a break. And so I...
1999 or?
Yeah, 1999.
So you were at Nelson Kinder.
From 91 to 99, I think, the dates. And I decided...
We'll call it Nelson Kinder Massot and Gordon.
Gordon, yes, that was my, my other name. And so I decided I would just leave. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. But I knew I didn't want to start another law firm right then. So I got it just fell into my lap. I got a wonderful opportunity. I was asked by Ovid LaMontagne and Bill Brennan and Walter Maroney, who was at the AG's office, if I would be the special master in the Optima Health disaffiliation
I
case.
had forgotten that.
Yeah.
Speak about learning a new area, right?
Yes, and that was a matter that was before the probate court, and it involved basically taking apart the merger of Catholic Medical Center and Elliott Health. And the lawyers in the case had decided that it would be more efficient, given all of the different issues involved in the disaffiliation, if they could get it, that they could develop their own protocol for handling it. And so they did. They developed a protocol which had me play a number of different roles depending on what the need of the parties was in particular issues. So I could serve as an arbitrator, I could serve as a mediator, I could just hold conferences to see if I could work things out. And my decisions had to be approved by Judge Cloutier at the Hillsborough County Probate Court. And it worked out really well. We were able to schedule things on, hours notice. I was able to do the work from my front porch. And the lawyers, once the two parties decided this needed to happen, I think their respective legal teams wanted to make sure that it happened as efficiently and as expeditiously as possible.
Were those New Hampshire law firms at that point on each
Yep,
side
they were,
of that case?
Yeah, it was Divine Millimet and Bill Brennan, Walter Maroney from the Attorney General's office, R.P. Saunders, who represented Optima Health and was a terrific asset to the process.
It was a different role for RP.
It was a different role for RP, but he was perfect in it. Great judgment, great insight, and like the lawyers for both of the parties, he, from Optima's perspective, had an interest in getting this done and done right for the people of New Hampshire. It was unusual because this was under the aegis of the probate court because these were charitable trusts. So I learned a lot about healthcare. I learned a lot about...
Who would know? It was so complicated, right?
Who would know, yes. I learned a lot about physicians' practices. I learned a lot about real estate issues. But most of all, the biggest thing I got out of it was the way that lawyers can put their resources together to make things happen for the good. It was a great process. We got to the end of it, and there was, I think the judge was happy with the way it got resolved, and it was just good. So, and at the same time, I happened on to an opportunity to teach at Vermont Law School. So I taught at Vermont Law School from 1999 to 2001. basically filling in for people who were on sabbatical. So I taught professional responsibility. I taught in the appellate advocacy program, taught some mediation, a lot of clinical stuff. But it was a great experience.
You've had, I have forgotten about all the varied experiences you've had, and I think you and I both probably run into younger lawyers who are 3 years out of law school who have spent that part of their career in one small area of the law, and I always, in some ways, I always envy that, and in other ways, just because of the nature of our practices in New Hampshire, and the nature of trial law, you don't get to specialize in anything.
No, I think that my current position is probably as specialized as I've gotten, and I'm enjoying that a lot. It's nice to, really understand an area of the law, and
that's
to
the
focus on
employment law practice you have now at Jackson
employment law.
Lewis.
Yeah, but again, I like the employment law practice because it's people. It's problem solving and it's
People under enormous stress.
People. But no, the teaching was great. I mean, it was a chance to sort of sit back and say, okay, now what do I want to do? And then the next career choice was made as a result of attending the First Circuit Conference in Puerto Rico.
I remember you at that conference with Emily Rice,
in
sitting
2001.
by the pool drinking umbrella drinks.
Yes, and I spent the weekend with Emily, who had just joined Orr & Reno, and Connie Rakowski, who had been a partner at Orr & Reno for a long time and a friend of mine since I was in the AG's office. Practicing with her now husband, David Marshall.
Who was also in the AG's office.
Who was also in the AG's office. And so over those umbrella drinks, they persuaded me that Orr & Reno was the place to go. And so that was my next move. And
that was the First Circuit Conference in which David Souter gave the speech about Bush versus Gore without once mentioning Bush versus Gore.
Right, and looked about as unhappy as any human being I've ever seen.
I don't think that was his happiest moment on the Supreme Court.
No.
So you went to Orr & Reno, and did you stay there until you went to Jackson Lewis? I don't remember.
There have been no more detours.
How many more law firms do you plan on? Do you think you're done, Marty?
I think I'm tapped out.
I'm
tapped out.
That's good.
And the greatest thing about Jackson Lewis is the practice, as well as the opportunity to move to the Seacoast, which is somewhere I've always wanted to live, and I've really enjoyed the 5 or 6 years I've been over there.
And to be in a national firm with a local office.
And a dog-friendly office.
You take your dog to work?
I can.
Only Jack Middleton's allowed to bring his dog to work in our office, and
I can imagine.
And even then, he's not really allowed to. But no one in the building dares tell him he can't.
And for somebody who's been coming to the office as long as Jack has, he deserves to bring his
All
dog.
the wonderful, great stories about Judge Grant. He used to bring his dog into the courtroom with him, or turn around and bounce a ball off the back wall of the courtroom if he was bored with the arguments.
I never had the opportunity to practice in front of Judge Grant.
Nor did I, but Judge
I have heard
Grant's
the
stories
stories.
remain.
There was one about a gun. That's all I remember.
So let's talk a little bit about, I'm not sure how much time we have left, but 10 minutes or so. How, from your perspective, the practice of law has changed since you've been in New Hampshire, and what you see, what good things you see in that practice, and what things that perhaps are not so good?
I would say that probably the biggest thing that has changed is the technology, which I think has made the practice, in some ways it's increased the efficiency of lawyers, but it has, in my view, taken away from the thoughtfulness, the judiciousness, the ability to be able to get a request or a letter from a client saying, I have this problem, I need this advice, and having the opportunity.
Have at least a day to respond to it.
And that has been, when I first started practicing, that was how it happened. A client would call and say, I've got this problem. I mean, when I first started practicing, it would be the partner telling me that the client had called, and the client was coming in and wanted to talk, and the client would come in or write a letter and talk and explain what the problem was, and you would say, that's very nice, I'll get back to you, let's set up a meeting for next week and we can talk about where we go from there. And then you'd go to the library and you'd research the issue, you'd talk to other people, you'd get a lot of input, and then that changed, and the client would then say, well, I'll Federal Express the documents to you, or I'll send them overnight. So you would at least have 12 hours to respond, and then fairly quickly after that, I'll fax them to you.
Right.
And you had, even then you had a little bit of response time, because faxing was a tedious process, and usually it would take a long time for those sort of glossy pages to slip out of the machine, were barely legible. But pretty soon it was email, and pretty soon it was 24/7 email, when you're expected to, a client sends you an email and you're expected to respond, or a colleague sends you an email and you're expected to respond. So it's, I think that the need to respond and react as quickly as we do, does affect your ability to reflect about problems. It does make it more efficient for the client. It's faster, it's cheaper.
It does allow us not to have to drive to Manchester every weekend as we used to have to do, and when you lived in Hopkinton or Concord, and if you worked on the weekend, that's what you had to do.
Right, right. Or at least you had to leave your light on in your office on Friday night and put a coat over your chair so that the partners would think you were there on Saturday morning.
Well, yeah, there was, and as I recall, Divine Millimet that wasn't optional. That was a Saturday morning, sort of like Saturday morning classes in college when I was in college.
Though, but those Saturday mornings, you really didn't get much work done, but you learned so much, because it was the Saturday mornings when you could walk into the office of someone like Don Dufresne or Mike McDonough or Norman Stahl or John Broderick and say, I've been working on this case and I got a problem, and let me just run this by you. And those were the greatest learning experiences.
I agree that you learned a lot by the osmosis of being around people, and you had some of the pressure of billable hours, which were not the same pressure that we have today, I think.
And that's another area that I think is a problem. I mean, the pressure of the billable hour system, and we still haven't, at least on the defense side, we haven't found very many good solutions to it. I think the real loss there is the loss that's experienced by the younger lawyers. You used to be able to take one or two or more younger lawyers along with you when you went to a hearing or a deposition, and that's where the real learning occurred. And now, if you take them, one of you doesn't get to bill usually.
And it shows up on your realization report at the end of the month. 'Cause I joke that our law firm now is big enough and we have enough reports so that someone looks bad on at least one of them every month.
You can make numbers do anything. Anything.
Everyone looks bad on at least one of them.
The pressure of the billable hours also, I think, diminishes younger lawyers' ability to do the things that we always thought were part of the profession, and that is to be involved in the community or in the bar association. I think it's very difficult for younger lawyers who are balancing the requirements of a job with family life to feel that they have the time and the ability to get involved in communities. And that's too bad.
I saw a statistic the other day that reminded me how old I am, but
everything reminds us of how old we are.
When I was in law school, 10% of the lawyers in America were women. And I think probably in my class in law school about maybe 10% as well. And now it's over 50%. And yet, I think every New Hampshire law firm struggles a bit with keeping good women in the law firm and keeping them as partners in the law firm. What's your observation on that, and how do you think that can be improved?
I didn't have quite the same experience that you had, or that I think a lot of women have had. First of all, when I went to Northeastern in the late 70s, it was 50% women, which was unusual.
And as you know, my son Brooks went there, and I
Yep.
think it was more than 50% women when he was
And
there.
it was also unusual in the sense that many of the people who went to Northeastern were there. Some people came directly out of college, but a lot of people had had prior careers, teaching or engineering or other careers. So it was just a different mix. And I think that the co-op experience going into a law firm and being ready to be a hands-on lawyer, I think gave me a certain amount of confidence that that probably didn't deserve to have, but I had it anyways. And then going to the AG's office, where you did get a tremendous amount of responsibility, and there was no, at least I didn't experience any distinction between the male lawyers and the female lawyers in the office.
that's right.
Everybody had the same amount
Everybody
of
was pretty
responsibility.
young, too. You know.
Everybody was young, everybody was over their head, and everybody was really good. And the only, I guess, the only discrimination, if you will, that I ever experienced was, despite the fact that Deb Cooper and I looked nothing like each other, when I went to court in the North Country, unless I was in Grafton County, where Deb's from, I was the lawyer from the AG's office, which meant I was the girl lawyer from the AG's office, which meant I was
Debbie Cooper.
I was Debbie Cooper, and she started running into the same problem. That same issue resurfaced at Divine Millimet. It was even more complicated because Eileen Fox and I are about the same height. We
Same
have
hair
about
color.
the same hair color. And I can remember being at a Robert Frost dinner at Plymouth State College with Eileen and watching David Nixon, who was then one of the senior members of the bar, approach our table. And you could see that as he approached the table, as he was working the crowd, he knew he knew we were both lawyers at Divine Millimet, but he really wasn't sure which one of us was which. But those are the kinds of things I just find amusing. I think it's hard to keep any lawyer, any good lawyer at a law firm. Maybe that's why I've jumped around so much. I think it's a tough job. It really is. If you do it well, it's hard, and especially if you want to have life outside of the law. I don't know that it's any more difficult for women than for men. But I think maybe women are smart enough to get out earlier, because they don't find that commitment or that amount of stress worth it.
I'm sure in law firms you've been in, and certainly in our firm, what people talk about all the time is work-life balance. So I guess I'd ask, how did you maintain that? Because you've got a lot of things you like to do outside the office, but have been a busy trial lawyer all your career. How have you managed to handle that, and what advice would you give to younger lawyers on that?
Well, I don't.
We're at the age where you have to say, what advice would you give to the younger people?
What advice? I don't know. I think I think the most important thing about maintaining a balance is maintaining your sense of humor. I think that if you approach everything
You
we
started
do,
working with Don Peralt. You had no problem with that.
I think that, you know, it's a question of taking the job seriously, but not yourself seriously. I think it's deciding what's important to you. For example, when I went to Divine Millimet, I remember feeling very pressured to go out to lunch every day with people. Because that was the culture. We were at the far end of Elm Street, and you really had to get into a car to go out to lunch. And I remember feeling uncomfortable saying, you know, the 3 or 4, usually men, would come to my office and say, you know, we're going to go catch some lunch. You want to come? And I would say no, because my son had a soccer game at 4 o'clock, and I made it a point of never missing any of Ben's soccer games. And so that meant, you know, I
don't remember you yelling at the coach.
I had no reason to yell. You put him in and you let him play. But you know, it meant coming in and focusing on my work and leaving at 3 o'clock and not making any apologies for it. And because that was important to me. And I became much less efficient when Ben graduated from high school and was no longer playing soccer, because I had all the time in the world to wander around from office to office and talk and go out to lunch. And it took me a lot longer to get my work done. So I think it's, you know, you just have to decide what's important for you. To me, it's important to stay involved in community things, and I just have to work
Why
around
is that
that.
important to you? I mean, is it there's a sense, at least at McLean, there's always been a sense that being involved in a community is important, not just for the practice of law and getting you out there to know people, but this is where we live. And a great advantage of a state like New Hampshire is you get a chance to do that.
Well, I also feel, I mean, I just feel very privileged. I mean, I grew up in a large family. I know what sacrifices people make. I have the benefit of a great education. I have the benefit of, you know, a lot of experience. And it's important to me to give some of that back, to try to, you know, try to make life a little better for some people. I have some passions about, you know, pro bono work and Campaign for Legal Services, United Way. And those things are important for me, and I make time. And if it means that I bill a little less and make a little less money at work, you know, I'm still so much more privileged than so many people that struggle.
Well, there's a lot more that we could cover, Marty, but that feels like a pretty good place to leave it. And thank you. I wondered how much fun it would be. I knew it would be fun, and it was even more fun than I thought. So
Okay,
thank you.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Thank you.